This is the third and final lecture on conquest and expansion. Okay, let us return to the PowerPoint to continue our discussion. So in the first two lectures, we've looked at the strategies of settlement, that is what white settlers started to do once they settled down in the West. Also, in the last lecture, we began to talk about how different groups were treated by white settlers. In this lecture, we will look at specifically the treatment of Native Americans, which were in many ways the largest group that was most affected by westward expansion. Now, as you can imagine, as white settlers moved westward and expanded westward, they came into conflict with Indians who were already living in those lands. So how did they cope with the so-called perceived Indian threat? And one of the first strategies that they devised in many ways built on this concept of manifest destiny that we talked about in the first lecture. But this strategy was to negotiate settlements and treaties in order to move tribes out of the path of white settlers. In 1851, the chiefs of most of the Great Plains tribes agreed to the first Treaty of Fort Laramie. And this agreement basically established distinct tribal borders and zones, what they called reservations. So reservations refer to land that the American government gave or assigned to American Indians in order to reduce the tensions between the Indians and the Western settlers. At these reservations, a lot of times, Indians actually face poverty and starvation because of the meager government rations that were distributed. So on this map, you can see the areas shaded by blue, shaded in blue, and these were the areas of Indian reservations circa 1890. So that was the first strategy. But very quickly, within a decade, as the pace and number of Western settlers increased, even designated reservations became prime locations for farm and mining. Instead of negotiating new or updating treaties, settlers simply attacked the tribes out of fear or tried to force them from the land that they wanted. And oftentimes, unfortunately, they were actually backed by local or state militia units. Some Indians resisted, but only then to face massacre. So the textbook actually goes on to talk about some of the most well-known incidents, massacre incidents that happened. The US Congress hoped to forestall these uprisings and all-out Indian wars, and in fact, they commissioned a committee to investigate these massacre incidents. The subsequent report of their findings led to the passage of more treaties, and one of the more famous one is the Second Treaty of Fort Laramie, which basically promised the remaining Sioux that the Black Hills in the Dakota Territory would be reserved for them. But this agreement was very short-lived because subsequently gold was discovered in the Black Hills. And by the middle of 1875, thousands of white prospectors were illegally digging and panning in that area. The Sioux, in response, protested the invasion of their territory and the violation of their sacred ground. The government, in response, offered to lease the Black Hills, or they actually tried to persuade the Indians to sell the land for $6 million. When the tribes refused, the government just imposed what they thought as the fair price for the land. They ordered the Indians to move, and in the spring of 1876, the government was making ready to force the Sioux onto the reservation. So in what came to be known as the Battle of Little Bighorn, this was perhaps the most famous battle of the American West. A Sioux chieftain by the name Sitting Bull urged Indians from all neighboring tribes to join him in defense of their lands. At the Little Bighorn River, the U.S. Army 7th Cavalry, led by the Colonel George Custer, sought a showdown. Driven by his own personal ambition, on June 25th, 1876, Custer foolishly attacked what he thought was just a minor Indian encampment. Instead, this turned out to be the main Sioux force. So the Sioux warriors, with nearly 3,000 in strength, surrounded and killed Custer and 262 of his men and supporting units. This was perhaps the single largest loss of US troops to an Indian attack in the era of westward expansion. So as you read about it in the textbook also refers to this incident as Custer's last stand, referring to Colonel Custer's last stand. And as you can see, there are both Anglophone lithographs, this one and this one, versus an Indian version of the way that they depicted what happened at the Battle of Little Bighorn. So as you look at these images closely, I'd like you to think about what do the different depictions tell you how the whites versus the Indians perceived what happened there differently. Who were the heroes? Who are at the center of these images? How are the opponents being represented? Okay, so these are some of the questions I'd like you to think about, because as you can tell, these images as historical documents, as sources, actually tell us a great deal about how historians remember crucial events in the past. And there are different perspectives that are being conveyed through different kinds of documents. Okay, so the final episode of the so-called Indian Wars occurred in 1890 at the Battle of Wounded Knee in South Dakota in 1890. On their reservation, the Sioux began to perform a dance called the ghost dance. And as you read about it in the textbook, right, this is a kind of non-violent form of resistance that actually combined Christianity and Indian religions. As they performed the ghost dance with such frequency, white settlers began to fear that there might be another uprising coming. So the militia prepared to round up the Sioux, and the tribe, after the death of Sitting Bull, who had been arrested, shot, and killed in 1890, were now prepared to surrender. So they tried to surrender. The details remain murky, but eventually the white troops eventually massacred between 150 to 300 men, women, and children. So with this last show of brutality, the Indian Wars came to a close. So all of this is in fact quite violent. It's nothing short of violence. But at the same time, a growing number of American reformers began to criticize the violence. They argued that the Indians should be helped through what they call Americanization, that is to become assimilated into American society. And the three cornerstones of this new idea of Americanization, which is probably the final assault on Indian culture and life, included one, individual ownership. That should be individual ownership of land. Second, Christian worship. And third, education for children. So the government actually permitted these reformers to remove Indian children from their homes and place them in boarding schools, such as this one, the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. At these places, the Indian children were taught to abandon their tribal traditions and try to embrace American tools of productivity, and modesty. Okay, adults were also targeted by religious reformers, specifically evangelical Protestants and Catholics, who tried to convince Indian adults to abandon their language, culture, religion, clothing, and social customs for a more Euro-American lifestyle. Finally, perhaps one of the most vital parts of this assimilation effort, and no less violent, I should add, is land reform. Okay, so most Indian belief structures did not allow for the concept of individual land ownership, right? Rather, in Indian culture, land was available for all to use and in some ways required the responsibility of all to protect the land. But as a part of their plan to Americanize the tribes, the reformers tried to institute legislations that could replace, right, the Indian concept of land with the popular Euro-American notion of real estate ownership and self-reliance. One of the most famous laws in this vein was the Dow's Allotment Act of 1887, and this struck a deadly blow to the Indian way of life. This, you can think of the Dow's Act as kind of the Indian version of what we discussed earlier, the Homestead Act. This allowed the federal government to divide the lands of any tribe and grant 160 acres of farmland or 320 acres of grazing land to each head of family. The act permitted the government to hold an individual Indian's newly acquired land in trust for 25 years. And only then would the Indian be able to obtain or granted citizenship rights that any land ownership entailed. It would not be until 1924 that formal citizenship was granted to all Native Americans. Under the Dawes Act, Indians were given the most useless land. And once all of the allotments were determined, the remaining tribal lands were sold to white American settlers, and that amounted to as much as 80 million acres. Okay, so this comes to the end of our lecture on the impact of expansion on American Indian life. So I hope that by this point, you should be able to describe the methods of US government, how they what methods they use to address the Indian threat problem. At the same time, you should also be able to explain the process of Americanization, what did that process entail, and how did that apply to Indians in the 19th century. And given what we talked about so far in this series of lectures on conquest and expansion, you should also think about how you might be able to compare and contrast the treatment of Chinese immigrants, Hispanic Americans, and American Indians in the 19th century. What are the similarities and differences in the way that American expansion had impact on their life? Okay, and finally, here are some of the key terms for you to review as you go over this chapter again. Manifest Destiny, Homestead Act of 1862, the first transcontinental railroad, Comstock Lode, barbed wire, Chinese Exclusion Act, reservations, and this concept was closely connected to the first Treaty of Fort Laramie, Battle of Little Bighorn, in the textbook also described it as the Custer's Last Stand, Battle of Wounded Knee, Ghost Dance, Carloso Indian School, and the Dow's Allotment Act. Okay, thank you.